Hey people, this video is for beginners as well as for advanced drummers, because maybe you know this. You try to adjust your pedals perfectly for you, but somehow you make it worse. Or you sit down on someone else's kit and somehow it works better than yours ever does. Or you have found the perfect setting, but you don't know how, and sometimes it doesn't work the next day. Don't worry, this is normal, and in this video I not only want to show you why, but also give you very specific help to solve these problems and help you to set up your pedals perfectly, even if you're just getting started on the drums. This video is quite long because I want to give you a complete guide on how to adjust the bass drum pedals, hi-hat, and also give you some tips about the maintenance of your pedals. So here you really have everything you need to know, or could know, because there can never be a complete overview on this topic because of the different models of drum hardware and also your personal preferences, but I have not found a good overview on this topic, so I made it myself. You get all the information you need from me so that you can then become active yourself, because you will always have to tinker, try and change things yourself. But if you know the most important factors influencing the feel of your pedals, then you can do it much more effectively than just trial and error. My wish is to help you gain an understanding of what you need to do to reach your desired goal and be able to quickly realize why your pedals aren't working for you and what you can do to change that. Of course, you're also welcome to use the chapter function to jump to the topic that you are looking for. So this video is also a kind of reference work. By the way, if you're really just starting out and looking for a book to use as a guide for your learning process, then I highly recommend the Drum Quest books, which I've had the privilege of working on with some other expert drum teachers and even a psychologist. It's a series of drum books with lots of practical exercises that systematically build your skills and always have a direct application for playing music. You don't have to start with the first book. If you've been playing for a few months and are already familiar with the basics of the drum notation, you can start straight away with stage 2. The link to the books is in the description. And there is also the link to the bonus PDF. This is like your cheat sheet. In this table you can see suggestions how you should set up your pedals for different styles of music. Just click on the link in the description, donate an amount of your choice, and you will be forwarded to the PDF. This way you support this channel at the same time. This video is divided into 4 chapters. First, the adjustment of the bass drum pedal, then specifically the double pedal, then an often neglected thing, the maintenance of the pedals, and finally the adjustment of the hi-hat. So let's jump right in. I'll walk you through all the pedal adjustment options and how they affect the feel of your playing. There are a surprising number of them, and not all of them can be changed on every model. What kind of pedal you use is of course crucial, but it doesn't take away the need to practice from you. Don't think that when you finally have your demon drive pedal, you'll be able to play fast right away. Yes, it has a big impact, but a well-adjusted, simple pedal will get you farther than a $1,000 pedal that isn't well adjusted. When it comes to choosing a pedal, 3 of the most important factors are the length of the pedal board. So if you're going for a long board, for example, that has more leverage, so it feels very smooth and easy, less bulky, so it's good for faster playing, and you have even more options with special techniques and can determine the pressure point even more precisely. Then the drive type, whether you play a pedal with a direct drive or a chain or strap drive like this one. This feels quite different and the pedal reacts differently to your input. And then there's the cam, whether it's round so the beater moves smoothly relative to the footplate, or eccentric so it speeds up as it gets closer to the head. With some pedals, such as my Darwin pedal here for example, you can even adjust this. So before purchasing a new pedal, read up on these factors, try out a lot, and there are still some videos and articles that offer some decision support so you have the best starting point for whatever music you want to play. But now let's get to the different setting options. It is very important here that we do not try to adjust one of these factors perfectly and then move on to the next. They also influence each other. It's like tuning the drums. We do it in several cycles, making finer and finer alterations. So first set everything roughly as you think it makes sense, and then approach your goal in smaller and smaller steps. By the way, if you do want to learn how to tune your drums better, I also have a whole series on this topic on this channel where I go through it all with you and give you lots of practical tips as well. First, let's look at the spring tension. This is what probably most of you have already been tinkering around with a lot, because this you can actually adjust on every pedal. Nevertheless, the influence is often overestimated. This is also due to the fact that the other settings can change the spring tension or its effect significantly. So here too, in order to save frustration, you should not adjust the spring perfectly and then go on to the next factor, but adjust it again and again in small increments. With most pedals, we do this by loosening the lock nut on top and then turning the lower nut to adjust the initial tension. Sometimes it also locks in place, then you have to press the whole thing down a bit so that the nut can move freely. With my Darwin pedal here, you just turn this nut here in the middle. A loose spring like this provides a smooth feel with little resistance. If you mostly play softly, I would keep the tension relatively low. However, you shouldn't set it so loosely that there is a point where there's absolutely no more tension, because then it simply no longer reacts so well. Also, when you have no tension at all, the spring could even fall out of the mounting and get lost during playing or transport. And if you have a smaller angle to the head, like 45 degrees or less, and the head is tuned very low, then you have poor rebound, meaning the beater doesn't return as quickly and your foot might lose contact with the foot plate. Such a pedal would feel very unresponsive. When the spring tension is higher, the feedback from the pedal is significantly better, but you also have to use more energy to make a stroke because the resistance is now also greater. If you play a lot from the whole leg, the tension can be a little higher. This is especially helpful if you sit fairly low, especially if you are a big person, because the weight of your leg alone works more against the tension than with very light people. And if you sit higher, and especially if you play mostly heel down, only from your ankle, then the tension should be significantly lower. If you want to play very fast, a high spring tension is beneficial because it helps getting the pedal to come back as quickly as possible. The choice of pedal or spring itself still has a major influence as well. If the pedal has a short spring, the tension will increase more when the beater gets closer to the head. The same is true if the spring is suspended farther from the axle. The rotation tensions the spring proportionately much more than when it's hung close to the axle. The effect then is that the closer you get to the head, the greater the resistance, but the beater also comes back faster. So the Darwin pedal really feels like the foot plate is glued to your foot. It's very responsive. So you can also swap out the spring and get an extra hard one if increasing the tension isn't enough for you. Many extreme metal drummers play with a heavier spring because they prefer very high tension. The second thing we look at is the angle of the beater to the head. In contrast to spring tension, this factor is often underestimated because it has a very big influence on how the pedal behaves. If the angle is larger, the spring is also tensioned more, and you also have a longer lever stroke, so you can develop even more power, and then the behavior of the cam also changes. For example, here on my Darwin pedal, if I make the angle very large, the cam ends here. In the resting position, the strap runs over this edge, so I have to apply more force to move the pedal. When I get over this edge, this force is transferred quickly and the beater hits the head with a high speed. So you can imitate the acceleration cam if you can't otherwise adjust the shape of the cam. But that only works if you can adjust the beater individually, the angle of the beater individually, because you would probably have to go so far back that the angle is too big. This is how I set up my pedal when I was playing for a German hard rock band, because I wasn't playing very fast there, but I really needed punch. And the fact that the pedal is always a bit slower at the beginning ensures that I play more powerfully and heavy, which fitted perfectly to the music. And the advantage is, if I then wanted to make quick strokes, I could just hold the beater close to the head, the cam runs smoothly here, and I have more tension in the spring, so the beater comes back quickly. With this setting, you can basically have two pedals in one. On most pedals, the angle is adjusted by loosening a screw here, where the spring mount attaches to the axle, and then adjusting the angle of the beater along with the cam and the footplate. This makes sense because if you just increase the angle of the beater, you have to travel a longer distance, and sometimes the footplate already hits the floor before the beater even touches the head. And it could also be that the cam then rotates so far that the lever is zero and you can no longer transmit any power, so the momentum would run out just before the head. This is especially important with direct drive pedals, but also with a chain or strap drive like this, make sure that they still unroll until the beater reaches the head. So the angle determines very much how your pedal reacts. Therefore, this can have a big impact on the performance of your pedal. As a starting point, I would recommend starting with a 45 to 55 degree angle. If you play rather slow and heavy, it can be even bigger, up to 75 degrees. If you play very soft and controlled, then maybe a little smaller than 45 degrees. Many who play very fast, for example in the extreme metal realm, play with a very small beater angle, but then also with a very high spring tension and often with a direct drive pedal. Surprisingly, some also play with a very large angle, but then mostly with a chain or belt drive. Here you can really find the extremes. If you want to play in that area, you'll go into more detail anyway. Incidentally, the beater angle is also something you can use to quickly adjust your pedals. Just like you use other sticks for different styles of music, when you play louder, you can simply increase the angle because that gives you more wind-up, and at the same time you put more tension on the spring, so you have more momentum and the pedal comes back nicely. And if you play more quietly, you can bring the beater closer to the head in just a few seconds, giving you more control and sensitivity. The next point is also often underestimated: the tuning of the bass drum head. You know this from the other drums. A snare drum is usually tuned much higher than a floor tom and therefore has a much better rebound. It's the same with a bass drum. Here it makes a huge difference whether you have a resonant head with a hole for a microphone or not. I once took my pedal with me when I was playing a gig on another drummer's kit. It was actually set up well, but it didn't work at all on this bass drum. This was because it had no resonant head at all. The air went out to the front and the drum head hardly gave any rebound. So I had to increase the spring tension significantly to compensate for that and also tune the bass drum head a bit higher. But if you have a higher spring tension and play a bass drum like you often have in jazz with a closed resonant head and tuned relatively high, then you often have an uncontrollably strong rebound. You would then have to loosen the spring a bit and maybe also adjust your technique. Sound should be your priority, so set your pedal to match the drum, but sometimes it can help tweak the head tension a bit for the finishing touch, especially if you use triggers or samples anyway, so the sound of the bass drum is not that important. That's why a lot of extreme metal drummers again have tuned their heads quite high and use quite a lot of dampening to have a good and controlled rebound. So the pedal feeling is the priority here because the sound is a sample anyway. In any case, now you won't be surprised anymore why your pedal feels different on another bass drum, even though you didn't seem to have changed anything. Incidentally, this can also be due to the fact that the hoops have different widths, so that the beater has to cover a greater or lesser distance on another bass drum to hit the head. Half an inch can make a big difference here. The beater should strike as vertically as possible. With some pedals you can adjust the clamp so that you can compensate for different rims. If necessary, you can also move the whole pedal back a bit if it is narrow, or reduce the beater angle if it is very wide. If that does not work or is not enough, you'll have to swap or modify the rim, but you can also compensate for this distance with different beater heads. And this brings us to the next factor, because the beater head mainly influences the sound, But its material and weight also affect how the pedal reacts, how strong the rebound is, or how light or sluggish it feels. The most important thing here is the weight. Some pedals have adjustable weights on the beater shaft. With some you can change the beater head entirely, or you just swap a weight that's inserted in the beater head. You would think that a heavier weight would make it feel slow and unresponsive, but that's not entirely true, because the rebound and thus the feedback that the pedal gives you are also stronger and ensure that you can maintain good contact with the pedal board and thus have a more direct influence on the pedal. Play around with different weights. Even some speed metal drummers play with surprisingly heavy beater heads or additional weights, and at the same time very high spring tension. But of course, if you play more heel down and more softly, then you should use heads that are as light as possible and not use weights. But what definitely makes the beater sluggish is when the radius is larger, that is, when the beater shaft is longer. That's the next factor. Ideally, the mallet hits the head right in the middle, so you need to adjust the length depending on the size of the bass drum you are playing. But beware, if you play a smaller one, for example 18 inches, then it is possible that the shaft sticks out at the bottom so far that it touches the head when you wind up for a stroke. Then you would have to saw it off at the end or get a shorter one. But if you want to have a lot of leverage, there are extra risers for small bass drums that lift the drum while the pedal stays on the floor. If you're playing an extremely large bass drum, say 24 inches or even larger, then you may need to get an extra long beater. Then the lever is really quite long and the feel is very heavy. But if you play such a big bass drum, you probably want it heavy anyway. Of course, the sound also has priority here. The starting point is hitting the head exactly in the middle, but that's not always the best option. So try hitting the bass drum a bit offset. Sometimes that can even be more suitable. And sometimes it's a compromise between feel and sound. And the last factor is the angle of the footplate. This can't always be adjusted independently, and it doesn't have to be, because if you can adjust the mounting point of the spring on the axis and the angle of the beater individually, then the result is that the angle of the footplate changes. However, you also change the position of the cam with this method. So be careful not to put it in an inefficient position. And beware, if the angle of the beater to the head is large and the footplate is very low, it will hit the ground before the beater is on the head. If you play heel down a lot, the pedal should be as flat as possible so your ankle can move comfortably. If you tend to slide forward on the footplate, then of course it should be a little steeper. Although it can also be that you sit too close or even too far away and therefore kick too far forward to compensate. Try it out a bit. My impression is that the angle can be quite decisive, especially at high speeds. So now you know all the possible components of adjusting your pedals. Now comes the question, how do I find the best setting for me? There are so many options. Where do I start? Don't worry, you don't always have to consider every factor because they influence each other. It can happen that you are already exactly where you want to be due to a change in the beater angle and a different weight, because this also changes the spring tension and the angle of the footplate as well as the position of the cam, for example. So it's not about setting every single factor perfectly, but starting somewhere and then seeing if and how the other setting options bring you closer to your goal. And the more you try, the better you'll know how the factors change the behavior of your pedal and can then make even more targeted adjustments. So feel free to start by making bigger changes and then slowly close in towards your goal. This way you will not only find your personal settings, but also at the same time you will know why this works for you, because you will get to know the possibilities of your pedal and experience how it affects the feel and behavior of your pedal when you change one or more factors extremely. And then you'll also know better what to do if you want to change the setting again, because it may well be that you have to adjust them again and again. This is normal and a good sign because you are evolving or playing other things, other kinds of music. But which factor should you start with? That's not so important because it doesn't make sense to set one perfectly and then the next, because the effect of the first changes again. So roughly bring it in the right direction first, do that with all the setting options, and then, so to speak, do one more cycle and fine-tune the settings more and more. Personally, I think it makes sense to start with the angle of the beater, because along with the shape of the cam, it has the greatest impact on the general feel of the pedal. The length of the beater and the weight should already be roughly fixed so that you can assess it realistically. And how do you know in which direction to adjust something? As I said, try it out. There's no way around it. But to make it a little bit more focused, first ask yourself what the pedal should do for you. What kind of music do you want to play? What techniques do you use? And how can the pedal support you in that? I gave you a lot of pointers about what the effect is, and in the bonus PDF you will find an overview with different settings for the different music genres and playing styles. Feel free to use this as a guide, but your solution might be quite different. If it works for you, then it's right. And it is also very important that you test a setting over several days so that your body has a chance to get used to it. You can of course make minor adjustments, but don't get frustrated if something that works one day doesn't work the next. Your technique hasn't had time to adjust, and maybe you're just exhausted from playing with your feet more than usual when you spent a whole day tinkering with your pedal. So play the exercises you usually do or a few rehearsals with this setup, and maybe even write down how it feels, how fast you could play, and so on. So you don't find the perfect setting by sitting down for an afternoon, but it develops over a longer period of time by trying things out again and again and making small adjustments. But then there is this frustrating moment when we think we finally found the perfect settings, but maybe we play on another drummer's kit at a show or even on our own kit and it doesn't work at all. Don't worry, this is completely normal and is due to several factors. Maybe you haven't practiced with these settings for very long, so it's just not that deeply internalized yet. Have patience and trust that at some point it will be so good that you can rely on it. In stressful situations and when you are excited, for example at shows, you may fall into old patterns. It's also possible that you've just found a sweet spot during testing that's just fun because the pedal runs perfectly there, but that only applies to a very specific tempo range, which is sometimes very small, and not to what you actually play in the end. It often doesn't fit anymore when the music dictates how fast you have to play, and that's not the sweet spot anymore. That's why I always say test the pedal with the settings under real conditions. For example, play a song that you want to play with it, and it's best if you always have the same test procedure in which you always use the same tempos and techniques to see where it works best objectively. And the seat height also has an influence. We'll talk more about that in the video about balance. Just this much, if you take it very seriously, then the seat height and the distance to the pedal are also part of the pedal settings, in addition to the bass drum tuning, for example. So you should also take that into account, especially if you're sitting on a different stool at a show. Speaking of tuning, as already mentioned, it can be that a different bass drum with a hole for the microphone or a different tuning simply reacts differently and the setting therefore no longer works. And last but not least, the position on the pedal is also crucial. Of course, a setting for speed metal only works if you operate it like a speed metal pedal. So try out where the best pressure point is for the respective setting and maybe even make a note of that. By the way, unless you're playing heel down, you're almost always further back on the bass drum pedal than on the hi-hat pedal. With a longboard, this can even be as large as 5 inches. This means that if you want to sit symmetrically, the bass drum would have to be a little further away from you than the hi-hat, or you could pull the hi-hat and the stool back a little. Now let's take a closer look at how best to set up a double pedal. Here basically exactly the same applies as said before, but with a double bass drum there are a few more things. If you have two single pedals and 2 bass drums, you just set both pedals exactly the same. But even this rule is not set in stone. Our legs are never 100% symmetrical or equally strong, if only because we move them differently on the bass drum and the hi-hat and thus train them differently. It can therefore also make sense to set them up a little differently. For example, I have a slightly higher spring tension on the left than on the right pedal. Speaking of symmetrical, here I would like to mention a very typical mistake again. If you see drummers with 2 bass drums, they are almost always symmetrical. Both are at the same angle towards the audience. That's just logical. You face the audience, so your legs point slightly to the left and to the right. But that also means that if you play with just 1 bass drum and a double pedal, we would have to sit in exactly the same position, meaning the bass drum is not facing the audience, but is at a slight angle. For visual reasons, however, most drummers position the bass drum in such a way that the resonant head aligns with the edge of the drum riser. As long as you're aware that you're sitting at a slight angle to the audience, that's not a problem. Unfortunately, many then sit twisted. The upper body faces forward, but the lower half of the body points to the side. Then you have asymmetrical strains which can be unhealthy and you don't play as evenly anymore. Symmetry isn't always the solution, but it should be your starting point. So when setting up, make sure that the upper and lower body are in one line as much as possible. If your legs aren't that far apart, then this factor doesn't matter as much because your feet are almost parallel. Symmetry is also the starting point when it comes to how the beaters hit the head. If you want the strokes to sound as identical as possible, the beater heads should hit exactly the same distance to the left and to the right from the center of the bass drum head. Unfortunately, this is not possible with every pedal. Sometimes the clamp only attaches in such a way that the main beater hits exactly in the middle, then the other one is offset by quite a bit, and you hear that and it also feels differently. If you only use the double pedal occasionally and play mainly with 1 foot on the bass drum, it doesn't matter. And if you use triggers or heavily compress the sound, it's hardly noticeable in the sound, but still in the performance of the pedals. So if consistency is important to you, you should switch to a pedal that gives you this option. The basic settings of the 2 pedals should of course also be about the same, so make sure that both beaters have the same angle to the head and that the cams on both sides have the same position, otherwise they will feel quite differently. The angle of the footplate should also be roughly the same, but here you can make an exception for 2 reasons. It can make sense to adjust the pedal that transmits the beater via the shaft, the so-called slave pedal, so that it has the same angle as the hi-hat pedal. In addition, the angle of the beater and the footplate can also be slightly larger if you often switch back and forth between the bass drum and the hi-hat, because then you have less time to wind up for a stroke where the beater normally would swing back a bit and gain more energy. The larger angle compensates for this missing lever. And another factor that is often neglected is the spacing between the 2 pedals, which you can adjust here on the shaft. And also make sure that all these screws are tight, because you can see here, if I don't tighten these screws, you have a lot of play here. And this also applies to the screws which attach to the axle here. Make sure that you are in the correct position, usually it's flattened on one side, and that you really tighten them. The spacing for a big part is determined by what other pedals you use. If you play a lot on the hi-hat, maybe the spacing might be a little smaller. If you prefer to play mostly on the double pedal and you need it pretty wide, there are also hi-hat pedals which give you the option to be placed inside this double pedal. And also take the flexibility of your hips into account. Some prefer to have this very close because they can just move more comfortably in that position. So don't forget this factor, it can have a huge influence, and keep in mind the further apart both pedals are, the bigger the angle of the pedals should be to follow the natural angle of your legs. So we see it is very important to consider what exactly you want to use your pedal for. This of course also applies when it comes to fine-tuning. You already know quite a bit about which parameters you can adjust and how, for example, to play faster, have more power or play with more control. Depending on your goal, you then adjust both pedals and then test them. But we also have to consider that we cannot always transfer the settings for a single pedal directly to the double pedal. Because we play with both feet, we move a little differently and can no longer support ourselves on one foot. Here too, it is very important to make a hypothesis as to how the pedal should be adjusted and then test it extensively under real conditions. So play what you want to play with it. As already mentioned, it is best to always have the same test procedures so that you can compare the settings. Go through all the tempos and techniques. This will prevent you from slipping straight into a tempo that works well with that setting and just stay in that sweet spot. You want to make it comparable. Therefore, you need an objective test procedure. And once you've found a good setting, give yourself time here too. So try it out for several days so that you get used to the new adjustments. Often the advantages only become apparent after a little time. And also, always be ready to make small adjustments. Feel free to use the table in the bonus PDF or the tips from the first half to find your perfect pedal settings. A cool tip here, by the way. If you really want to set both pedals the same, there is a way to bring the spring tension to the same value very quickly and precisely. If the beater angle and weight, as well as the position of the cam, is set on both pedals exactly the same and one of the pedals has the ideal spring tension, then you put two identical dumbbell weights on the same exact position on the pedal. If it slips, just put a piece of rubber underneath. And then you change the spring tension so that one pedal moves closer to the other. If the beater is closer to the head, then increase the tension. If it is further away, then decrease it. Tap the pedal slightly in between to see where it levels off. If both end up in exactly the same starting position, most of the time the playing feel will end up being pretty much the same on both pedals. If you don't have weights, use something that fits comfortably on the pedal and is exactly the same weight, like a juice box. If all other parameters are set exactly the same beforehand, you can fine-tune it pretty well with this method and end up with both pedals swinging exactly the same a few times when you tap them. This doesn't have to be perfect and can never be exactly the same with a double pedal because of the transmission via the drive shaft, but they shouldn't behave completely differently if they are to feel the same under your feet in the end. If you still can't get both pedals to behave the same way, then have a look and see if there's play in the joints of the shaft because the moving parts are worn out. This is quite common and unfortunately has a very large impact on pedal performance and hinders faster playing. Hold the cam of the slave pedal and then see if you can move the beater on the other side. If this is the case, first make sure that all the screws are actually tight. If it's still moving, you should replace this part. Incidentally, ACD Unlimited also offers upgrades here, because this shaft is a weak point in some foot pedals, and so you can significantly improve the performance of your pedal and get a lot out of a cheap foot pedal. Incidentally, this also applies to maintenance. If you can't play your pedal the way you want to, the first thing I would recommend is clean it thoroughly and lubricate the moving parts. I've seen drummers stunned because they hadn't oiled their pedals in years, and once we did, things suddenly went so much better. Here are a few quick tips on how to do that. First, keep the pedal and the area around it clean so that less dust and dirt settles on the pedal. I leave my drumming shoes in the rehearsal room and make sure that they don't get dirty, and above all, always keep the area around the drum kit very clean. I then brush off the pedal itself or wipe it clean, but of course dry. Since the dust collects in the smallest openings, you should clean the pedal thoroughly every now and then, maybe even take it apart. You can also use compressed air spray or, like me, a ball pump to blow the dust out. And if you lubricate the pedal, use very little oil and wipe off any excess, otherwise it will attract dust and dirt and have the opposite effect. Of course, a high humidity also has a negative effect on the pedal. The bearings are usually not made of stainless steel, and moisture can penetrate into the closed ball bearings in the long run. So make sure that the humidity is always around 50%, which is good for your drums anyway, and that the pedal doesn't get wet otherwise. First things first, don't use WD-40, that's more of a solvent. You can use fine oil or chain oil, for example. Most manufacturers also offer special oil for their pedals. Give a little bit on the moving parts, such as the suspension of the spring or the joints of the double pedal shaft, and wipe off all excess oil thoroughly. The hi-hat has fewer moving parts. The chain, some have an extra transmission, and if you're being very exact, also the joint of the foot plate. Ball bearings are usually closed and greased, so you don't have to do anything. With older pedals, or if it has gotten wet, you can put it on its side and put a drop of oil on it and move it a little bit. Then the oil will soak into the bearing, unless they are rubber-covered ball bearings. By the way, you can also use dry fluid instead of oil. This has the advantage that it does not attract dust and it lasts for a long time. If in doubt, look at what parts are built into your pedal, then you can find out how best to maintain them, and if in doubt, simply follow the manufacturer's care instructions. With some transport cases, you bend the beater back in the direction of the footplate. Then you should definitely unhook the spring so that it doesn't wear out. The same applies, by the way, if you don't play the pedal for a long time, but then only if you have a really high tension. In addition, the pedals should never be packed away when they are wet, because then they will rust very quickly. I know that is not always realistic, for example on tour, when you have to pack up your instruments quickly at an open air concert, in the evening when the air is damp or it's even raining. And like everything on the drum kit, the pedals are also a commodity. But try to keep them as dry as possible, and if you pack them up wet, unpack them as quickly as possible and lubricate all the moving parts. In this way you can significantly increase the lifespan and performance of your gear. And as already mentioned, you can of course also replace individual parts. The bearings of the heel plate and the cardan shaft are weak points, especially on cheap pedals. But springs can also wear out. A spare part can be a good investment, or ask ACD Unlimited about upgrading your pedal. Because if you have play somewhere, because some joints are worn out, all lubrication doesn't help, then you have to exchange the parts so that the input that you give through your technique is also efficiently and effectively transferred to the head. And finally, I would like to help you to adjust your hi-hat pedal as well as possible, because there is a surprising amount of options here too. So again, you don't have to accept how your pedals behave, you can change that to your needs. First, make sure that all the 3 feet, sometimes you only have 2, and also the base plate touch the ground. This ensures that the whole hi-hat stand is stable and does not slip. If the floor is uneven, it can help, if possible, to have this part in the middle slightly raised so it does not touch the floor. Then only 3 points are having contact with the ground, and as you know, a table with only 3 legs never wobbles. When I know where exactly the hi-hat should be, I press the feet down from the top, jerk it a little bit, and then tighten this screw. You can usually extend spikes at the bottom so that the pedal doesn't slip away from you while playing. But this doesn't work on very smooth floors, so you should always use a rug or a mat. If you don't have one with you, you can use a thin doormat in an emergency. The rule of thumb is that the pedal should be positioned so that your legs are in a symmetrical position when playing. My foot is further forward on this pedal relative to the bass drum, so the hi-hat is a little closer. Most designs also allow you to rotate the feet so you can find the perfect position if other stands get in the way, or if you're using a double pedal. Usually you need to loosen another screw for that. What can we now adjust on the hi-hat that affects the feeling and performance of your pedal? The first is the general height of the cymbals. To change this, you loosen the clutch at the top and this screw at the bottom. Be careful, hold this tube tightly so you don't pinch your fingers. And then you set the height you want to play at. If you're playing open-handed, it's probably only slightly higher than the snare drum. If you play conventionally and rather quietly and controlled, maybe a lot on the surface, not on the edge of the cymbals, then maybe 4 to 6 inches higher than the snare. If you play very loud and need a lot of space to play the snare, then the distance may have to be very large. And of course, this also depends on your body size and seat height. Especially with children, the hi-hat, like the snare, should be nice and low so that they don't get used to hunching their shoulders. If you have set the general height, then of course you also have to fix the upper cymbal. To do this, attach the clutch. How exactly, I'll show you in a moment. Then you put the cymbals on top of each other with the screw loosened and step down the pedal as far as is comfortable for you, and then you tighten the screw. And do it firmly, because if you play with your foot, the rod will slip through and the distance will increase. If you don't play the hi-hat with your foot or play a lot of double bass drum, then the distance shouldn't be very large. But if you do more with your foot, maybe also use splashes, then the distance should be such that both pedals move about the same distance. To achieve this, put both feet on the pedals in their starting position and then move them down exactly the same way until the beater of the bass drum touches the bass drum head, and then tighten the clutch. Now both pedals travel roughly the same distance to the stopping point. Cymbal spacing is definitely a personal matter and can vary greatly depending on what and how you play. In any case, you should determine the distance with your foot and not with your hand. Apart from just being a little bit impractical, you can set the distance too large so that the cymbals don't even touch when you play the pedal. What affects the playing feel and also the sound of the hi-hat is how tightly the upper cymbal is fixed within the clutch. It should be attached like this. First the 2 lock nuts, then a felt, then the cymbal, and again a felt. The lower nut is then tightened until it stops. Tighten it also really firmly, because it can be loosened by the vibration while playing, and if that happens on stage, that's nothing you can fix again quickly. You need both hands for that. How much the cymbal moves between the felts is determined by where the lock nuts are. The bottom one sets the position and the top one is then tightened against it to keep them both in place. It should not be so loose that there is excess noise when playing with the foot. If you pull the lower nut very tightly against the cymbal on the other hand, then it can swing less, so it behaves very controlled, but sounds a bit dampened, and if you play the hi-hat open, it sizzles less, you have more of a gong sound. If you prefer this, you can of course do it this way, but since the cymbal is more tightly clamped, it can tear more easily. I would recommend to adjust it so that there is no gap between the felt and the cymbal, but it can still swing a bit. What you can also adjust is how much the lower cymbal is tilted, because cymbals are never 100% straight and neither are the felts. Besides, they should not be exactly parallel, because if you then want to play a short note with your foot, a kind of air pocket is created and it sounds muffled. For this reason, hi-hat cymbals exist where the bottom one has holes, or you can adjust them so that they are not exactly parallel but at a slight angle to each other. The lower cymbal lies on a felt, which lies on a metal plate, and you can raise or lower it on one side with this screw. The angle also affects how it sounds when you play the hi-hat slightly open. You can play around with this setting and you'll find that the impact on the sound and feel is surprisingly large. As with the bass drum pedal, you can also change the spring tension on the hi-hat. There are very cheap versions where you unfortunately cannot change that. If you are or want to become a bit more ambitious, you should definitely upgrade. How exactly you change the tension is always different. Sometimes you have a dial. Here I pull up this pin and twist this piece of plastic so it snaps into place. A high tension makes the pedal come back quickly, so if you play the hi-hat with your foot a lot, it can help. However, it then becomes tiring to keep the cymbals closed and there is background noise when you lift your foot quickly. If the tension is very low, the cymbals may not fully separate. So the pedal hardly comes back, is unresponsive, and you can't use all the possibilities of the hi-hat. As a starting point, adjust the spring so that when you lift your foot, the upper cymbal rises all the way to the top, but does not hit the top. With these settings, you already have a lot of possibilities. With some pedals, you can also change the angle of the footplate. This makes a lot of sense if you want both pedals to feel exactly the same, and especially if you frequently switch between double bass drum and hi-hat. Then the footplates should be pretty much the same angle in the resting position. I can't do that with this pedal, but I can simply cut open a cymbal felt and tape it around the bottom of the pull rod. Now it hits earlier and the pedal sits flatter, which was my goal in this case. So this is a simple hack that you can use as well. And then there are hi-hat stands, especially those with two legs, where you can change the tilt of the entire stand. For example, if you have the hi-hat very low but still want to play it on the edge, then tilt it away from you slightly. This can be especially helpful when you are playing open-handed. And then of course there are remote hi-hats with a cable with which you can freely decide where the cymbals are located. Seat height and distance to the pedal are also important factors. If you play more heel down, you should not sit too close or too low, and the pedal should not be too steep. And where your foot is on the pedal also makes a big difference. You should always keep this in mind when you change the settings. For example, if the cymbals are very far apart and you play the pedal very far forward, then the foot would have to travel quite a distance. And then there are different models that have different feel due to their drive type. But that should be enough for us at this point, because you should try it yourself anyway. With what you now know, you are definitely well prepared. You can also return to this video at any time and look up individual things with the chapter function. If you still have questions, please write them to me in the comments, because at the end of this series there will be a video in which I will answer the most frequent ones. And if you want to see more videos about drums, effective learning and personal development, then please subscribe to this channel and now ask yourself, what was this video worth to you? Now that you have seen it, how much would you have been willing to pay if it wasn't free? Please put this amount into the donation box. This channel can only survive if you are honest and each and every one of you donates a little something. The link is of course in the description. Thank you so much for your honesty and support, and see you in the next video. Take care and bye bye.